not a good time to be a member of the Williams family right about now. It's been hard out here, up in these streets. The news broke through yesterday morning, that Williams have cancelled their title sponsorship of Rocket Phones. That was yesterday. It was also followed up by a story that was posted all over the place on Formula One social media and news sites like Autosport that it looks as if Claire is at least open to the idea of selling at least a part of the team, maybe even all of it, if the right scenario or context came about. Claire did say that the team is fully funded through 2020, which is, I guess, a good thing. It's not like the team's going to imminently collapse. They have the money to get through this season, but they're now open to selling the team. This is after they announced that the team made a £13 million loss last year. It's shit, and it just compounds the rumblings we've heard about Williams for the last few months now. I mean, earlier this year, I think it was only about a month or so ago, there was a story that... Actually, no, you can go back a little bit further now. You can go back to the end of last year, where Williams, they sold arguably their biggest resource they had, and that was their engineering division. It was sold off at the end of last year. It turns out, I think about a month or so ago, they restructured the finances of the company and had to take a loan from Michael Latifi, Nicholas's dad, who's obviously driving for the team this year. They had to take a loan from Michael Latifi to keep money afloat within the team to be able to compete and run this season. Clearly evidencing a bit of a cash flow problem. It was mortgaged against the land that Williams as a team is developed on, as well as the museum of historical cars they have was used as collateral in the deal. So, in other words, if they can't repay this loan whenever they can, if they default on the loan, their historical wing and the cars that are in it, which is arguably the most precious resource Williams have left, that historical land is at collateral. It's at risk of being taken away if Williams can't repay their loan. And now they've lost their title sponsor, and they're looking to sell at least a chunk of their team. This is apparently in the best interest of the team. There's rumours that there's 3 or 4 parties that are considering buying them out. But it is shit. Look, I take no pleasure in stories like this. And I am a guy that I don't even like to call myself a motorsport journalist, but it's one of those things I have written about in the past. I wrote about this back in 2014, about how unsustainable the sport was at any level, any common sense person looking at the situation in F1, how the money is divvied up in terms of the inverted pyramid prize structure going down the line, bonus money for wins, etc., meant that we now have a culture where the rich keep making money, the big teams keep making more and more prize money and stay competitive and stay winning all the time, whereas teams that drop off the wagon, it's very, very hard for them to get back in. And if you want to see a walking example of that in the last few years, look at Williams. And it's a little bit sad, because I saw this story break out yesterday morning on Twitter, and I saw a lot of people pin this on Claire, did the deputy team principal who's running the team day to day, because obviously Father Frank is not doing the day-to-day operations of the team anymore, and Claire is in charge. I think it's a bit too easy to pin the blame on Claire Williams, and I'm not saying she's perfect. I'm not saying that she, that losing elements like BMW were never helpful for Williams as a team, but I don't think any general manager or team principal running this team could have salvaged or saved the team from entering this sort of, on the precipice sort of state that they're in now. And don't get it twisted. Williams was struggling for a while, but even before the hybrid era came up. I mean, let's look at the V8 era in general, right? 2006 is when the V8s were introduced. Williams in the Constructors, 8th. They were 4th in 2007. They were 8th again in 08. 7th in 09. 2010, the more modern era, social media era, as I like to call it. 6th. Okay, middle of the road. They had one of their worst ever season for points scored in 2011, when they only scored 9. That was when they had Maldonado join the team alongside Rubens. They replaced Rubens with Bruno Senna because they needed money. They had they were 8th that season. They scored more points, but they didn't improve in position very much, despite them winning a Grand Prix that year. And Pastor, I still stand by to this day, Pastor Maldonado was probably a little bit better than we gave him credit for on the internet, just because he had a couple of reckless incidents. The man could drive a car. You don't beat Fernando Alonso in a dogfight on merit by coincidence. The man could drive. There's no doubt about that. But then, the last year of the V8s, they had one of their worst seasons ever. 5 points scored, 9th in the Constructors' Championship, only scored points twice the whole season. 1 10th place finish from Maldonado, and then Valtteri Bottas in the penultimate race at America, when he finished in 8th. But then something amazing happened. They actually built a really good hybrid out of the gate with the new regulations, and that's one of the things that can save a team, is that they nailed the newest regulations that came out when the hybrid era started. They came out of a really efficient, really reliable car. They chose correctly by having the right power unit supplier in their team, in Mercedes, powering their cars. And they went from 9th to 3rd. They were brilliant in 2014. They had 9 podium finishes. And for all the talk about Daniel Ricciardo and how he beat Sebastian Vettel in the 2014 season, I don't think we ever gave Valtteri Bottas enough due for that Williams season in 2014. He was an absolute Driver of the Year candidate that we didn't give enough credit for. Maybe it's because Williams wasn't as high profile as Red Bull was, and that Daniel Ricciardo obviously won 3 races that season, but Valtteri was right up there as well. They scored 320 points that season and finished 3rd in the Constructors' Championship. They were excellent that season, and they were one of the few teams that could take the fight to Mercedes on a given day that season. It didn't happen very often, and it came to the best of the rest party that season. Williams was right up there. They really were, and they were 3rd in the next 2 seasons in the Constructors' Championship. But I always had a rumbling, and I always had a thought in the back of my head that I thought that this wouldn't last. I remember this because I remember Claire Williams spoke about the hybrid power units at the start of 2014, and I can't remember where she said it. I think it might have been BBC's F1 forum, their post-race show they would have on the iPlayer or on BBC Red Button after a Grand Prix had finished, where she talked about how because the hybrid power units had twice as many moving parts as the V8s that had come before it, running the cars were literally twice as expensive as they were during the V8 era. Now, everybody knows these hybrid power units are very technically complicated. They're a lot more complex than the V8 internal combustion engines we had beforehand. So running costs, upkeep and operating costs shot up through the roof during this era, and I was always afraid that Williams would not have the money or the firepower to be able to keep up with the other big name teams they were battling against in this period, and I was right. They went from 320 in 2014 to 257 points wise in 2015, and then 138 the year after that, 83 the year after that, and then 7th. They only scored 7 points in 2018. So 3rd, 5th, and now back-to-back years where they were 10th in the Constructors' Championship, stone dead last. They've been in steady decline points-wise since the hybrid era began. They were never able to maintain their dizzying form of being near the top of the sport or being an elite team in the sport. Now, I don't think Claire could have been able to do anything about that, and I don't know if any other team principal would have been able to do anything about that. By all accounts, by the general letter of the law of what we expect F1 teams to do and how they make key decisions over the course of running a team, they did everything right. They nailed a set of regulations. They chose the best engine supplier in the field, or power unit supplier in the field. they hired good drivers. Valtteri Bottas was an outstanding driver that ended up going to the best team in the sport afterwards. Massa was a reliable number 2 still for a couple of years. You know, they did pick a good blend of drivers that were well funded, but also had some level of ability. Like, I'm not fully convinced on Lance Stroll as a driver, but the man was a champion in Formula 3. That doesn't mean he's terrible by any stretch of the imagination. Sure, this is going to be a big season for him to see whether he's worth continuing in Formula 1 in terms of sheer talent. But him, I think Sergei Sorokin was a pretty good driver by all accounts, and held his own in that Williams team. And he was pretty unlucky to lose his seat. And this was the guy that everybody just screamed, oh, he's a pay driver, when he came into the sport, because that's what we do with drivers we don't think are good enough. We immediately label them as a pay driver. I mean, that's a cultural issue with the sport that is a separate discussion entirely. But they also brought in guys like Paddy Lowe. They had a very good, very recognisable brand name as Martini, as a brand sponsor and as a title sponsor. By a lot of accounts, they ticked a lot of the boxes that would lead to an F1 team being great. But if the money's not there, the money is not there. And I don't think Claire would have magically been able to save that. And it sucks. And I feel really bad for them as a team. Look, we are talking about the sport's greatest independent. It would be a damn shame if they went the way of the dodo. They represent so much of what makes the sport great, and that is its independent teams. Of course, you need factory backing in any motorsport series to really take off. But at the same time, you need the independents. You need the people that are on their own with the guts and the bravery to try and take the fight to the big boys. And it's frustrating when the king of the independents is, in by all accounts, real trouble. Taking out loans, mortgaging the land, selling off assets, putting more assets at risk, now openly saying the team is essentially up for sale. It's a bad sign, but it's also a further scope on the state of the sport right now. I think it's easier to pin the blame on a team principle. I think the conversation that's harder is to talk about the nature of the sport and once again, how unsustainable it is as a sport. I've said it for half a decade or longer. If you're not in the top 4 in Formula 1, you're surviving, you're not competing. You're trying to keep the doors open. Like, the newest team we've had was Haas, and they saved money by buying a lot of assets from I think it was the Marussia team that collapsed and faded away in the middle of the hybrid era. Gene Haas, who is a billionaire of his own right, said he was willing to lose $100 million a year to make this work. Think about that sentence for a minute. I'm willing to lose 9 figures a year to keep an F1 team open. And Haas is another team that's gone down the pecking order over the last few years. They started great, but has again been in steady decline for the last couple of years. And, you know, were very, very poor last year. And, you know, they had the PR disaster of Rich Energy. Their drivers didn't drive particularly well. Their team slipped down the order. They were struggling to score points. And there's now question marks about their future. There's been question marks about Renault's future. I mean, yeah, great, they're going to stick around. I mean, they announced this yesterday, but this is also a factory that's about to lay off 15,000 staff and are in the middle of a French government bailout. It almost makes me feel uncomfortable that something as expensive as a Formula 1 team is prioritised over thousands of people's jobs. It doesn't exactly instill me with confidence about the future of the team going forward when thousands and thousands of people's jobs are not worth it. You know, Force India are going to become, you know, or Force India or Racing Point as we now know them, are going to become Aston Martin next year. And this was after Lawrence Stroll had to put £170 million into Aston Martin as a car firm to invest back into the company. He's not going to get a good chunk of that money back. Aston Martin's share price cratered this year. No one's buying their cars, especially in the middle of a coronavirus pandemic and inevitably a recession that's going to hit afterwards. It's tricky times for the sport right now, even trickier than normal, and we've got some objectively good measures coming. I am very glad that we finally have a budget cap coming in 2021. This was something that was promised in 2010 when we had the artists formerly known as Lotus, Virgin and HRT enter the sport, taking the sport up to 24 cars with the promise there would be a budget cap coming to help them compete, which never materialised. Shocker, all three teams are no longer with us in Formula 1. And you're not going to get billionaire investors coming in with a brand new team, because starting a new F1 team from scratch is ludicrously expensive. I'm glad we got a budget cap coming. It's long overdue. We should not be encouraging factories to spend £300 to £400 million a year on car development. It's a ludicrous amount of money, and that bubble will burst because independent teams can't keep up with it, and we haven't got enough factories to justify just having it as a factory team sport. It's not going to happen. Like, investing all this money into motorsport is not happening right now. Read the room. A lot of these factories are withdrawing their support of motorsport series, not throwing more money into the fire, which right now might as well be a black hole. You know, I'm glad that we've got a budget cap and concessions. I still argue, I think $145 million still might be a bit too much. If teams are gonna restrict themselves further, if they can't spend up to that cap, then what's the point? I still think the factory teams will end up still at the top because they have resources. I think that's part of why the same teams still ultimately tend to win in places like IndyCar, which is a lot more spec, but yet Penske will still win the majority of the races in any given season. It's because they have resources, experience, and they're able to harbour and take the best talent. But it's certainly a step in the right direction, especially on aero concessions as well. That is objectively a good move that could bring the field closer together. It's no coincidence they've taken a page out of MotoGP's book, and I remember MotoGP doing this, and I remember they brought in standardised ECUs, the electronics department of the bikes, in 2016. Everybody raised an eyebrow at first, but what happened in 2016? 9 different riders won a race. Independents could challenge the status quo of the factory runners for victories. When we had Jack Miller winning in Assen that season, it was the first time an independent had won a Grand Prix in 10 years in MotoGP. It was massive. It was a game changer for the sport because the competitive balance that it brought to MotoGP is the reason why it's more popular now, even if the man in front is still the dominant champion of the day. It doesn't matter so much because the quality of the racing is still excellent. Marquez isn't curb stomping everybody every week, but he's winning. But the races he's winning in are entertaining. And I think F1 would love nothing more than to be in that position. But we are still in a position where the top 3 teams are a second of a lap faster than everybody else. I think that budget cap should be even lower. I think it should be around the $100 million a year mark, not 145. You know, it is a bit of a crippler to the big teams, but their resources will still keep them on top, at least in my opinion, over the independent teams that are always going to get second or third pick on staff, on resources, and on drivers. But it is a step in the right direction. But the ultimate point of this video for me is that I don't want people to blame Claire for this, and I think Williams' decline is another warning sign for the state of the sport and its general health going forward. But I'd love to hear what you guys think. As always, let me know in the comments down below if you can, and I will talk to you guys early next week. But until then, I've been Dre, thanks very much for watching, and I'll talk to you guys soon. Sayonara.